evening of June 9, 1944, 6 millisea from Tawi Tawi in the narrows of Cibutu Passage between the Philippine Islands and the northeastern tip of Borneo, Commander Samuel Day stood in the conning tower of the United States submarine Harder, watching through the periscope as 2 Japanese destroyers crossed his field of vision. They were patrolling the passage, moving in what his fire control officer called overlapping formation, close enough together that a single spread of torpedoes might reach both targets. The moon was down, the sea was calm. The destroyers were silhouetted against the lighter water beyond them, their bows cutting phosphorescent wakes through the darkness. DI had already sunk 2 destroyers in the past 3 days. The Japanese Navy was hunting for him with increasing desperation. Every destroyer in the vicinity had been ordered to find and destroy the submarine that had penetrated so close to their major fleet anchorage. But Day was not running. He was hunting. At 1,000 yards range, he ordered 4 torpedoes fired. The submarine shuddered as compressed air ejected the Mark 114 torpedoes from their tubes. The weapons began their runs toward the overlapping targets. Inside Harder's control room, men held their breath and listened. The submarine's executive officer, Lieutenant Frank Lynch, counted seconds on his stopwatch, calculating the time it would take for the torpedoes to reach their targets. Then the first explosion, a tremendous detonation that shook the submarine even at this distance. The second and third torpedoes struck seconds later. When DIY ordered the submarine to surface moments afterward to observe the results, neither destroyer remained afloat. Where 2 warships had been patrolling just minutes before, there was now only a large cloud of steam and heavy vapor hanging over the water, illuminated by a lighted buoy that marked where the second vessel had gone down. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What the crew of Harder did not know, could not know as they submerged again to escape the inevitable counterattack was how profoundly this action would affect Japanese naval planning. The simultaneous destruction of 2 destroyers from a single torpedo spread represented something the Imperial Japanese Navy had not considered possible. Their doctrine, their training, their entire understanding of submarine warfare did not account for this level of aggressive close-range attack. And the psychological impact on Japanese commanders would alter the course of a battle that had not yet been fought. To understand why this moment mattered, why it seemed impossible to the Japanese officers who learned of it, we must understand what destroyers meant to the Imperial Japanese Navy in the summer of 1944. The Japanese destroyer was not simply a warship. It was the embodiment of a fighting philosophy that had guided Japanese naval thinking since their victory over Russia at Tsushima in 1905. Fast, heavily armed, equipped with the most advanced torpedoes in the world, the Type 93 long-lance oxygen torpedoes that could reach targets 20 m away. Japanese destroyers represented offensive power, concentrated in ships that could move at 35 knots and fight at night with tactics other navies could not match. The destroyers patrolling near Tawi Tawi in June 1944 were there for a specific reason. The anchorage sheltered the combined fleet, including Vice Admiral Jizaburo Ozawa's first mobile fleet with its aircraft carriers. These ships represented Japan's hope for a decisive naval victory that might change the trajectory of a war that had turned increasingly unfavorable. The destroyers screening the approaches to Tawi Tawi were not merely guards. They were hunter-killers trained specifically to detect and destroy submarines. Japanese destroyer doctrine emphasized aggressive anti-submarine tactics. When sonar detected a submarine, the proper response was immediate attack. Close the range quickly. Force the submarine deep with depth charges. Keep it submerged until its batteries depleted and it had to surface where guns and more depth charges would finish it. Japanese destroyer crews had been drilled in these tactics since their earliest training. They had confidence in their ships, in their weapons, in their ability to hunt submarines. American submarines, in the Japanese understanding, operated cautiously. They attacked from distance. They fired spreads of torpedoes from several thousand yards away, then dove deep and ran. The attacks were effective against merchant shipping certainly, but against warships, particularly against destroyers that could maneuver and counterattack American submarines, were supposed to be at a severe disadvantage. This understanding was not merely wishful thinking. It was based on experience from the early years of the war when American submarine tactics had indeed been cautious, when torpedo problems had plagued the United States submarine force, when Japanese anti-submarine forces had achieved genuine successes. But the war had been ongoing for nearly 3 years. By June 1944, the American submarine force had changed. Torpedo problems had been solved through months of agonizing investigation and testing. New tactics had been developed and refined through hundreds of patrols, and a particular type of submarine commander had emerged. Men who hunted destroyers not despite the danger but because of the strategic value. Commander Samuel Dealey was 38 years old when he took Harder into the waters around Tawi Tawi. He was a graduate of the United States Naval Academy class of 1930. Had served on battleships and destroyers before volunteering for submarine duty in 1934. He had been commanding Harder since her commissioning in December 1942. By June 1944, Harder had completed 4 war patrols, and Dealey had developed a reputation among submarine commanders for aggressive tactics that bordered on reckless tactics that produced results. The 5th War Patrol, which brought Harder to Tawi Tawi, had been conceived specifically to hunt Japanese destroyers in waters where the Japanese fleet was concentrated. Vice Admiral Charles Lockwood, commander of the United States Pacific Submarine Force, had recognized that Japanese destroyers were not merely warships to be avoided. They were strategic assets whose destruction could affect major naval operations. If enough destroyers could be sunk near Tawi Tawi, it might force the Japanese to alter their plans for the coming battle in the Philippine Sea. Dealey had departed Fremantle, Australia on May 26, 1944. Harder made the transit to the Philippine Sea and took up position near Cibutu Passage, a major transit route between Tawi Tawi and the open ocean. On June 6, Harder had encountered her first target, the destroyer Minazuki. The engagement demonstrated Dealey's tactics. Rather than firing from long range and fleeing, he had allowed the destroyer to close within 1,100 yards before firing 3 torpedoes from his stern tubes. 2 torpedoes struck. Minazuki sank in 5 minutes. The next morning, June 7, another destroyer, Hayanami, came searching for the submarine that had sunk Minazuki. Dealey again waited until the range closed to 650 yards before firing. 3 torpedoes were launched. 1 struck Hayanami amidships, apparently detonating the ship's magazine. The destroyer exploded with such violence that the submarine, still submerged, was rocked by the blast. Hayanami sank in approximately 1 minute. Now it was June 9. 2 destroyers destroyed in 3 days. The Japanese Navy knew a submarine was operating in Cibutu Passage. They knew it had sunk at least 1, possibly 2 destroyers. Every available destroyer in the area had been ordered to find it, and that evening, 2 more destroyers entered the passage, patrolling the narrowest point just 6 miles from the fleet anchorage. They maneuvered Harder to intercept. The approach was undetected despite the destroyers actively searching for submarines. At 1,000 yards range, with both destroyers visible through the periscope in overlapping formation, he made the decision to fire at both targets simultaneously rather than attacking them sequentially. 4 torpedoes left the submarine. The fire control solution had been calculated to send 2 torpedoes toward each destroyer, spaced to account for their forward motion during the torpedo's run. The first torpedo reached its target. The explosion sent a column of water and debris into the air. The second torpedo struck the same vessel Tanakaze. Seconds later, the destroyer's boilers erupted with what observers in Harder's conning tower described as a terrific explosion. The third and fourth torpedoes reached the second destroyer. Both struck. The vessel, later identified as destroyer Kazagumo, was torn apart by the explosions. Both ships sank almost immediately. When Harder surfaced less than 2,000 yards from the attack point minutes later, the ocean was empty, except for steam, vapor, and the burning light buoy. The submarine's crew could not see the human cost of what they had just accomplished. Approximately 300 Japanese sailors had died in those explosions. Most would have perished instantly in the detonations or in the boiler explosions that followed. Some survived the initial blasts only to be trapped in sinking ships as watertight doors sealed automatically, flooding compartments where men pounded uselessly on steel bulkheads as the water rose. Others made it into the water but found themselves swimming in fuel oil in darkness with no rescue immediately available because the nearest ships were miles away and did not yet know what had happened. But the larger impact was not measured in the immediate casualties. It was measured in the psychological effect on Vice Admiral Ozawa and his staff at Tawi Tawi. When the reports arrived, 4 destroyers sunk in 4 days, with the most recent attack destroying 2 vessels simultaneously. Ozawa faced a command decision that would affect the upcoming battle. The Japanese plan for what would become the Battle of the Philippine Sea depended on timing. American forces were preparing to invade Saipan in the Marianas Islands. Ozawa's fleet would sortie from Tawi Tawi, rendezvous with other Japanese naval units and strike the American invasion fleet. The plan required coordination, careful timing, and the element of surprise. But the submarine operating near Tawi Tawi had destroyed 4 destroyer escorts in 4 days. Who could say what else might be waiting in the waters around the anchorage? How many American submarines were positioned along the likely routes the fleet would take when it sorted? Ozawa made the decision to depart Tawi Tawi early on June 10, 1 day ahead of the planned schedule. The fleet would take a more circuitous route to avoid submarine concentrations. The early departure meant the rendezvous with other Japanese forces would be disrupted. The timing that had been so carefully planned would be thrown off. The combined fleet would have to slow its carrier force to allow other units to catch up, exposing it to American submarines for a longer period during the transit. None of this was known to DIY or his crew. They completed their patrol, transmitted their reconnaissance reports on the Japanese fleet movements, and departed the area. Harder arrived at Darwin, Australia on June 26. The crew learned they had been credited with sinking 5 destroyers. Though post-war analysis would confirm for definitively. DI was recommended for the Medal of Honor. Harder received a Presidential Unit citation. But the strategic effect of those 4 days in early June extended beyond the citations and the confirmed tonnage. When the Battle of the Philippine Sea commenced on June 19 through 20, 1944, the disruption to Japanese timing contributed to what became known as the Marianas Turkey Shoot, a catastrophic defeat for Japanese naval aviation that cost them 3 aircraft carriers and hundreds of trained pilots they could not replace. Japanese commanders who later analyzed the battle noted the problems with timing, with coordination, with the fleet movements that had been rushed and disrupted. Some specifically cited the submarine attacks near Tawi Tawi as a factor that had forced unwanted changes to their operational plans. The psychological impact of having 4 destroyers sunk so close to a major fleet anchorage had convinced them that American submarines were operating with capabilities they had not anticipated. This brings us to the central question. Why did the simultaneous sinking of 2 destroyers from a single torpedo spread seem impossible to Japanese naval commanders? The answer lay not in the technical capability. Clearly, it was possible since it had occurred, but in their doctrinal assumptions about how submarines fought. Japanese anti-submarine doctrine presumed that submarines would fire from long range, that they would flee after firing, that they would prioritize survival over pressing an attack. A submarine that allowed destroyers to close within 1,000 yards was a submarine that had made a tactical error and would likely be destroyed by depth charges. But Dealey's tactics inverted these assumptions. He deliberately closed the range. He fired at distances where Japanese doctrine said a submarine should be running away. He waited for overlapping targets rather than firing at the first available target and then diving to escape. He surfaced after attacks to observe results, remaining in an area where depth charges were falling and more Japanese ships were certain to arrive. These tactics were not reckless bravado, they were calculated aggression based on understanding of submarine capabilities and destroyer limitations. A submarine that stayed deep and maneuvered slowly could be tracked by sonar and attacked with depth charges. But a submarine that moved quickly, that changed depth and bearing frequently, that surfaced when not expected to surface, that submarine was harder to track and destroy. The aggressive close-range firing eliminated many of the variables that made long-range torpedo shots difficult. Less distance meant less time for the target to maneuver, less chance that the torpedo would veer off course or run too deep, more certainty in the fire control solution. Japanese destroyer captains found themselves facing an opponent who fought in ways they had not been trained to counter. When depth charges forced a submarine deep, they expected it to stay deep and try to escape. Instead, Harder would go deep briefly, then come shallow again, repositioning for another attack. When destroyers turned to close the range for what should have been a decisive depth charge run, they found themselves targeted by torpedoes fired at ranges where evasive maneuvers were impossible. The simultaneous destruction of 2 destroyers from a single spread was the crystallization of all these factors. It was technically possible for torpedoes fired at overlapping targets at 1,000 yards range, but it was doctrinally unthinkable because it required the submarine to remain in position in waters where multiple destroyers were actively hunting for it to fire at both targets rather than attacking one and fleeing to accept the risk of counterattack in exchange for the chance to destroy both vessels. In the wardrooms and operations centers where Japanese naval officers discussed the Tawi Tawi losses, the questions were uncomfortable. If destroyers could be sunk in pairs by single submarines, what did that say about destroyer screening effectiveness? If submarines could operate this aggressively this close to major fleet anchorages, where could the fleet actually be safe? If American submarine commanders were willing to take these kinds of risks, what did that imply about their overall strategic confidence? The answers to these questions were not comforting. They suggested that American submarines had become far more dangerous than Japanese anti-submarine doctrine accounted for. They suggested that the defensive measures, the destroyer patrols, the sonar searches, the depth charge attacks were not adequate against opponents who fought this way. They suggested, though few Japanese officers wanted to articulate it directly, that American submarine crews had both better equipment and superior tactical training. This realization spreading through the Japanese naval command structure in the summer of 1944 contributed to an increasingly defensive posture that would characterize Japanese naval operations for the remainder of the war. Fleets would sortie less frequently. When they did move, they would take more circuitous routes, consuming more fuel and time in an effort to avoid submarine concentrations. Destroyers that should have been screening aircraft carriers or supporting amphibious operations would instead be assigned to anti-submarine patrols that produced minimal results while consuming resources. For Harder and Commander Dealey, June 1944 represented the peak of success. 2 more war patrols followed. In August 1944, during Harder's 6th patrol, the submarine was operating in a wolf pack with Hake and Hado off the coast of Luzon in the Philippines. On August 22, Harder and Hado had destroyed 3 Japanese escort vessels. On August 23, Hado attacked a damaged destroyer, but expended all torpedoes. Harder and Hake were called in to finish the target. Early morning, August 24, Hake dove not far from Kaimun Point, about 4 miles off Hermana Major Island on the west coast of Luzon. Harder was visible approximately 4,500 yards south of Hake's position. At approximately 0600 hours, Hake heard depth charge explosions from the direction where Harder had been. Later that morning, Hake observed through her periscope a Japanese minesweeper and destroyer searching the area. More depth charges fell. Harder never surfaced. She never reported. 79 officers and men were lost with her. Post-war examination of Japanese records indicated that the escort vessels CD-22 and patrol boat PB-102 had detected Harder on sonar and attacked with depth charges. The submarine damaged by depth charges after the conning tower apparently lost control and sank in water over 3,000 feet deep. There were no survivors. Commander Dealey was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. His citation specifically noted the 5 destroyers sunk during the 5th war patrol, describing it as 5 vital Japanese destroyers sunk in 5 short-range torpedo attacks. The irony is profound. The tactics that made Dealey and Harder so successful: aggressive close-range attacks, willingness to remain in dangerous waters, repeated engagements in areas where the enemy was concentrated, were the same tactics that ultimately led to their loss. Modern submarine warfare was and remains a balance between aggression and caution, between pressing attacks and preserving the vessel and crew for future operations. Dealey had found remarkable success by tilting that balance toward aggression. But the mathematics of repeated risk-taking are unforgiving. The submarine that takes calculated risks every patrol will eventually encounter a situation where the calculation proves incorrect. Yet the strategic impact of Harder's actions in June 1944 extended far beyond the submarine's own fate. The disruption to Japanese fleet movements before the Battle of the Philippine Sea contributed to the American victory in that engagement. The psychological effect on Japanese naval commanders influenced their operational planning for subsequent months. The proof that aggressive submarine tactics could succeed against destroyer screens informed American submarine doctrine for the remainder of the war. When Japanese officers discussed submarine warfare in the war's final months, they spoke with respect about American submarine commanders who fought in ways Japanese doctrine had not anticipated. They acknowledged privately, if not in official reports, that their anti-submarine forces had been unable to counter opponents who combined technical capability with tactical aggression. They recognized that the loss of 4 destroyers in 4 days near Tawi Tawi had been not an anomalous occurrence, but a demonstration of capabilities they had failed to prepare for. The simultaneous sinking of 2 destroyers from a single torpedo spread on June 9, 1944, remained in Japanese naval memory as the moment when assumptions shattered. 2 warships, 300 sailors, gone in seconds because a submarine commander had done what Japanese doctrine said submarines would not do. Closed to point-blank range, fired at overlapping targets, and remained in position long enough to observe the results before diving to evade counterattack. The technical achievement was notable, the tactical execution was impressive, but the psychological impact, the realization among Japanese commanders that their understanding of submarine warfare had been inadequate, that their defenses could be penetrated, that their most dangerous weapons could be sunk in pairs by enemies. They could not effectively counter that impact resonated through Japanese naval planning until the war's end. In the final accounting, Harder sank 4 confirmed destroyers, 2 frigates, and damaged or sank multiple other vessels during 6 war patrols. To prove that aggressive submarine tactics against destroyer screens could succeed if executed with skill and precision. The crew demonstrated repeatedly that close-range torpedo attacks against alerted defenders were possible for commanders willing to accept the risk. But the broader lesson transcended any individual submarine or commander. It demonstrated that in modern naval warfare, psychological factors, the assumptions commanders make about how opponents will fight, the doctrinal frameworks that shape tactical decisions, the confidence or lack of confidence that comes from repeated success or failure. These factors matter as much as technical capabilities. The Japanese Navy had destroyers, sonar, depth charges, trained crews. They had everything necessary to defend against submarine attack. What they lacked was the doctrinal framework to counter opponents who fought differently than expected. When the 2 destroyers sank on June 9, taking 300 men with them, what died along with those sailors was a set of assumptions about submarine warfare that had guided Japanese naval thinking since the war's beginning. The realization that those assumptions were wrong came too late to change Japanese strategy, too late to develop new tactics, too late to train new commanders in different approaches. The war had moved beyond the point where tactical adjustments at the destroyer screening level could affect strategic outcomes. Harder and her crew paid the price for aggressive tactics in August 1944. But the impact of what they accomplished in June continued to shape how both sides fought submarine warfare for the remainder of the Pacific War. That is the enduring significance of a single torpedo spread that destroyed 2 destroyers simultaneously. Not the technical achievement alone, but what it revealed about the gap between doctrine and reality, between assumptions and capabilities, between how commanders expected wars to be fought, and how they actually unfolded when opponents refused to follow the expected script. The Mark 14 torpedo that left USS Harder's tubes on the evening of June 9, 1944 was not the same weapon that had plagued American submarines in the war's early years. Understanding what made those 4 torpedoes effective requires understanding the bitter path American submariners had walked to reach that point. When war began in December 1941, the United States submarine force possessed what should have been a decisive advantage. The Mark 114 torpedo was designed to carry a 660-pound Torpex warhead, run at 46 knots, and detonate beneath enemy ships using a magnetic influence exploder that would break the target's keel. The weapon represented years of development and significant financial investment. Submarine commanders went to war confident in their primary weapon. That confidence shattered within weeks. Torpedoes ran beneath targets without exploding. They exploded prematurely, alerting targets before impact. They struck targets squarely and failed to detonate. They ran in circles, endangering the firing submarine. Commander after commander returned from patrol reporting torpedo failures, demanding investigation. The Bureau of Ordnance, responsible for torpedo development, insisted the weapons functioned correctly and blamed submarine crews for improper firing procedures. The dispute consumed months. Submarine commanders knew their torpedoes were failing. They documented the failures in patrol reports with photographs with detailed firing data with testimonies from multiple crew members who had witnessed the problems. The Bureau of Ordnance responded with technical studies claiming the torpedoes met specifications with accusations that commanders were making excuses for missed shots with assertions that any problems resulted from improper maintenance or handling. Vice Admiral Charles Lockwood, who assumed command of the Pacific Submarine Force in February 1943, made solving the torpedo problem his priority. He authorized live fire tests against cliffs in Hawaii, where torpedo performance could be directly observed. The tests revealed that torpedoes ran approximately 11 feet deeper than their depth settings indicated. An adjustment was made. More tests revealed the magnetic influence exploder detonated prematurely in the magnetic fields near volcanic islands. The magnetic feature was deactivated, forcing reliance on contact exploders. Then came the discovery that shocked even experienced ordnance officers. The contact exploder, designed to detonate when the firing pin struck the detonator, failed when torpedoes hit at perpendicular angles. The mechanism had never been properly tested under realistic combat conditions. The firing pin would jam rather than triggering detonation when impacting at 90 degrees angles, precisely the angle that resulted from successful attacks against ships' hulls. Only hits at oblique angles, glancing blows that might not sink the target anyway, reliably detonated. The fixes required redesigning the firing mechanism, manufacturing new components, distributing them to submarines scattered across the Pacific, and training crews in proper installation procedures. The complete solution was not implemented until September 1943, 21 months after the war began. 21 months during which American submarines fired thousands of torpedoes that failed to function as designed. 21 months during which Japanese merchant shipping continued operating because the weapons meant to destroy it did not work. By June 1944, when Harder approached those two destroyers in Cibutu Passage, the torpedo problems had been solved. The Mark I 14 torpedoes in Harder's tubes would run at their set depth. They would not explode prematurely. When they struck target hulls, the contact exploders would function. The weapon that should have been ready in December 1941 was finally operational in mid-1944, but weapons alone did not account for Harder's success. The submarine herself represented accumulated improvements from 3 years of combat experience. Harder was a G-tier-class submarine, 311 feet long, displacing 1,500 tons surfaced and over 2,000 tons submerged. Her 4 diesel engines could drive her at 20 knots on the surface. Submerged, electric motors provided 9 knots for brief periods or 2 knots for extended underwater operations. The crew complement was 6 officers and 54 enlisted men, though wartime loadings often exceeded 80 personnel when embarking special mission teams or additional technicians. Every man had a specific role, specific training, specific responsibilities during combat operations. The torpedo rooms, 6 tubes forward, for aft, were manned by torpedo teams who could reload tubes in approximately 8 minutes under combat conditions. Fire control teams calculated firing solutions using mechanical computers that integrated target bearing, range, speed, and angle on the bow to determine proper torpedo settings. Commander DS' approach to training his crew differed from many submarine commanders. He insisted on repeated drills for every combat scenario, including situations other commanders considered too dangerous to practice. Down-the-throat attacks, firing at destroyers, charging directly at the submarine, were practiced until every crew member knew his role without conscious thought. Night surface attacks were rehearsed until Harder could approach targets, fire, and dive in minimal time. The crew functioned with efficiency born from repetition, from trust in their equipment and each other, from confidence that their commander knew what he was doing even when what he was doing seemed suicidal. The Japanese destroyers Harder faced on June 9 were formidable opponents. Tanakaze, commissioned in 1940, displaced 2,000 tons and could reach 35 knots. Her armament included 6 5-inch guns and 8 24-inch torpedo tubes carrying the Type 93 Long Lance torpedoes, weapons with 20 range powered by oxygen-enriched fuel that left almost no wake. She carried depth charges and trained crews experienced in anti-submarine warfare. Kazagumo, slightly smaller at 1,900 tons, carried similar armament and had been specifically assigned to anti-submarine patrols around Tawi Tawi. Both destroyers were actively searching for submarines. Their sonar operators listened for the distinctive sounds of electric motors, of water flow around submarine hulls, of mechanical noises that might reveal a submerged vessel. Their lookouts scanned the surface for periscope wakes for the phosphorescent disturbances that submarines sometimes created when maneuvering at shallow depth. Their commanders knew at least one American submarine was operating in the area. They knew it had already sunk at least 2 destroyers. They were alert, prepared, hunting. What they were not prepared for was a submarine commander who treated their presence not as a threat to evade but as an opportunity to exploit. When WWII identified the 2 destroyers in overlapping formation, he recognized a tactical opportunity that required immediate action before the target separated. The fire control solution was calculated quickly. Range 1,000 yards. Target bearing changing as the destroyers moved across Harder's field of view. Speed estimated at 18 knots. Angle on the bow calculated for each target. 4 torpedoes were fired in a spread pattern designed to compensate for small errors in the fire control solution. If the destroyers were moving slightly faster or slower than estimated, if their course was a few degrees different from what appeared through the periscope, the spread pattern increased the probability that at least some torpedoes would strike. The Mark 114 torpedoes accelerated to 46 knots within seconds of leaving the tubes. They ran at their set depth of 8 feet, shallow enough to strike destroyer hulls, but deep enough to avoid broaching the surface where they might be spotted. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The first torpedo reached Tanakazi at approximately 2,315 hours. The impact occurred amidships below the water line in the vicinity of the forward boiler room. The 660-pound Torpex warhead detonated with a pressure wave that ruptured hull plates, destroyed internal bulkheads, and sent a column of water and debris erupting above the destroyer's deck. The explosion severed steam lines, cut electrical cables, and flooded compartments faster than watertight doors could be sealed. Men in the forward boiler room died instantly, either from the explosion itself or from superheated steam that filled the compartment within seconds. Those in adjacent spaces heard the detonation, felt the ship shudder, then heard the shriek of escaping steam and the rush of incoming water. Some reached watertight doors and sealed them, trapping their shipmates but preventing the flood from spreading. Others found themselves on the wrong side of doors that sealed automatically, leaving them in darkness as water rose. The second torpedo struck Tanaka seconds later, hitting further aft near the engine room. This explosion was more catastrophic. The destroyer's boilers, operating at full pressure to maintain high speed during the patrol, erupted when the torpedo blast fractured their casings. The resulting detonation, not from the torpedo alone, but from the boilers exploding, was visible from Harder's position 1,000 yards away. Dealey, observing through the periscope, later described it as a terrific explosion, the kind that indicated a magazine or fuel bunker had been penetrated. Tanakazi's hull structure failed. The ship did not gradually settle by the bow or stern. It broke apart. The forward section, severed by the combined force of torpedo and boiler explosions, began sinking immediately. The aft section remained briefly afloat, then turned vertical and slid beneath the surface. The entire sequence from first torpedo impact to complete sinking took less than 3 minutes. Of the 210 officers and men aboard, perhaps 30 reached the water alive. Most of those died within hours from injuries, exposure, or fuel oil ingestion. The third and fourth torpedoes reached Kazagumo while her crew was still processing what had happened to Tanakazi. They had heard the explosions, seen the flash of light, watched their companion vessel disappear. Then their own ship shuddered from 2 impacts in rapid succession. Both torpedoes struck on the port side. The first penetrated the hull near the water line abreast of the bridge. The second struck further aft. Kazagumo's commanding officer who survived the initial impacts tried to order damage control parties to contain the flooding, but communications had been severed. Electrical power failed. Emergency lighting provided only dim illumination in spaces that were filling with water and smoke. The destroyer began listing to port almost immediately. The list increased rapidly, reaching 30 degrees within 2 minutes of the impacts. Men attempting to reach their damage control stations found themselves climbing what had been vertical bulkheads. Equipment secured for sea broke loose and slid across tilting decks. The order to abandon ship was never formally given because the ship's communication system had failed. Individual officers and petty officers made the decision themselves, ordering their men to the rails and over the side. Some crew members trapped below decks attempted to reach topside through hatches that were now horizontal rather than vertical, requiring them to climb while water rose beneath them. Not all succeeded. Kazagumo capsized approximately 4 minutes after the torpedo impacts, trapping perhaps 60 men inside the hull. The destroyer sank in water over 1,000 feet deep, too deep for any hope of rescue for those still alive in air pockets. When WWII ordered Harder to surface at 2,330 hours, just 15 minutes after firing the torpedoes, the ocean surface was empty except for debris and survivors. The submarine approached to within 2,000 yards of where the destroyers had been. Through the periscope and then from the bridge. After surfacing, the crew observed a large cloud of steam and heavy vapor hanging over the water. A lighted buoy, automatically released when Kazagumo sank, burned on the surface, marking the location, but no ships remained. Both destroyers, 4,000 tons of naval vessel, over 400 men, had simply ceased to exist in the span of 5 minutes. Lieutenant Frank Lynch, Harder's executive officer, later wrote in his personal diary that the crew's reaction was subdued. There was no cheering, no celebration. Men who had served in submarines long enough understood what those explosions meant for the sailors on the receiving end, but there was satisfaction, grim professional satisfaction that their training had worked, their weapons had functioned, their tactics had succeeded, and there was awareness that more Japanese ships would soon arrive. The depth charges would begin falling within minutes once other vessels in the area heard about the attacks. They ordered the submarine to dive at 2,340 hours. Harder went to 300 feet and rigged for depth charges, securing all loose gear, shutting down non-essential equipment, preparing for the concussions that would follow. The crew waited in silence, broken only by the sound of the submarine's electric motors and the ventilation system. Then came the first explosions. Muffled thuds transmitted through the water, pressure waves that caused the hull to flex slightly. The depth charges were not close. The attacking ships had not yet located Harder precisely, but they continued for hours. At Fleet Headquarters in Tawi Tawi, Vice Admiral Jizaburo Ozawa received the initial reports shortly after midnight. 2 destroyers lost in Cibutu Passage. No survivors recovered yet. The submarine that had sunk them had escaped. This brought the total to 4 destroyers confirmed sunk in 4 days. All in waters that should have been heavily defended. All by apparently the same submarine that continued operating despite repeated attempts to locate and destroy it. Ozawa's staff officers gathered in the operations room to discuss the situation. The planned sortie of the combined fleet was scheduled for June 11th. But now they faced a dilemma. How many American submarines were positioned in the waters around Tawi Tawi? Standard doctrine suggested that submarines operated independently, perhaps occasionally in pairs, but for destroyers sunk in 4 days suggested either multiple submarines working in coordination or a single submarine operating with unprecedented aggressiveness. Neither possibility was comfortable. If multiple submarines were present, the planned sortie route would take the fleet directly through waters where it could be attacked repeatedly during the critical period when the ships were leaving the anchorage and forming up for the transit to the Marianas Islands. If a single submarine was achieving this level of success, what did that indicate about American submarine capabilities and tactics? What other assumptions about submarine warfare might prove equally wrong? The intelligence officer pointed out that the submarine had sunk destroyers using close-range attacks rather than the long-range firing that characterized most American submarine operations. This suggested either exceptional skill or exceptionally aggressive commanders, possibly both. The operations officer noted that attempting to hunt down this submarine before the sortie would require committing additional destroyers to an area where 4 had already been lost, potentially worsening the situation. Ozawa made his decision early on the morning of June 10. The fleet would sortie that day, 24 hours ahead of schedule. The route would be modified to avoid Cibutu Passage entirely. The fleet would take a longer path through the Sulu Sea and then east toward the Philippine Sea. This would require additional fuel consumption and would disrupt the carefully planned timing for the rendezvous with other Japanese forces, but it would avoid the area where the American submarine or submarines were clearly operating with impunity. The orders went out at 0600 hours. Ships began preparations for immediate departure. Destroyers that had been assigned to hunt for the submarine were instead ordered to take up screening positions for the carrier force. The logistics officers recalculated fuel consumption based on the longer route and determined that the carrier force would need to slow to 14 knots rather than the planned 18 knots to ensure sufficient fuel reserves for the coming battle. None of these Japanese decisions were known to Do or his crew. Harder remained submerged throughout June 10, occasionally coming to periscope depth to check for surface ships, then going deep again when the area proved too active for safe surfacing. The crew ate cold meals because using the galley would create odor that might be detected by Japanese ships passing overhead. They spoke in whispers and moved carefully to minimize any noise that might reveal their position. They waited for darkness when the submarine could surface safely to recharge batteries and ventilate the increasingly stale air inside the pressure hull. Admiral Su Toyota, commander of the combined fleet, received Ozawa's report on June 10 at his headquarters in Japan. The report detailed the destroyer losses and the decision to sortie early. Toyota approved the decision, but requested additional analysis of the submarine situation. He wanted to know how American submarines had penetrated so close to a major fleet anchorage, how they were achieving such success against destroyer screens specifically deployed to prevent submarine attacks, and what measures could be implemented to prevent similar losses in the future. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.